The morning the corn went up, the town smelled like diesel and smoke and something older, a smell that tasted like the end of summer. I had been up before dawn, because you always are when you feed 300 acres of corn and a family that depends on it. The rows were running like a green ocean, tassels shaking in a light wind, dew clinging to leaves like tiny lamps. It was the kind of morning that makes you feel small and steady at the same time, like you're part of some slow machine that keeps turning. I was checking the irrigation lines when the call came. The voice on the other end was breathing hard. "Fire! In the east field! You better get here." The county patrol was 5 minutes away, but the fields were closer to town than to the station. In 10 minutes I was driving over dirt that had turned to mud in places overnight. By the time I crested the rise, I could see the smoke column, thin, then fat, a dark plume that painted the sky. People were already gathering at the edge of the road, neighbors in boots and pajamas, faces lit by the glow, phones out. You don't want your heart to be an engine that runs itself in panic, but mine did anyway. My trailer was parked by the Goonite tanks, the cheap radio on, the dogs waiting in the cab with faces like questions. The corn was a beast of a thing when it burns, a dry, hungry roaring. By the time we got close, the east 20 acres looked like an ocean of red and orange. Fire raced like it had legs. The neighbors were trying to get a plow in. Some had old extinguishers. Others were just standing, mouths open. I ran because running is what farmers do, and the smoke hit me like a hand. Someone shouted my name. It was Maria from the Johnson place. "It started by the fence," she said. "Down by the HOA boundary. We saw someone there." The woman with the red pickup. She was talking to herself. The words felt like someone handing me a match after asking if I liked fireworks. There are people who love to gossip, and then there are people who notice. Maria watches the road like it's a television show. She had seen the red pickup back and forth on the gravel at odd hours for weeks. I didn't want to believe it. You don't want to believe your neighbor would do something like that. But the eyes of half the town were on me, and the fire didn't care what I wanted. By the time the fire crews showed up, the flames had already taken hold of the stalks and were licking at the irrigation ditches. The volunteer trucks from 2 towns arrived. Sirens muted in the way small town sirens always are. Less a parade, more a neighborly clamor. They threw lines, soaked the furrows, and kept the blaze from reaching the northern fence where the combine and the grain dryer sat. If the machines went, I would be ruined. When the boots stopped crunching and the hoses hissed and the last of the embers hissed out like cat, the field looked like the moon. Half my crop was gone. It takes a year and 100 decisions to grow a field. Weather and seed and timing and love. All the little calculations. One arsonist with a can of lighter fluid and a grudge could finish what a drought could not. The sheriff's deputy took statements like a machine set to calm. He asked where I'd been, if I had enemies, if any thieves had been seen. I told him what I knew. The red pickup. The woman who walked the HOA property line and glared at anything that didn't meet her color scheme. "Karen," someone muttered. "HOA Karen. Every small town has that one person who polishes her rules into a religion. She sent letters about hedges and mailbox flags. She wrote stern emails about which bird feeders were acceptable. People made jokes about HOA Karen. Nobody took her for an arsonist. But then the security camera footage started showing up. Someone across the lane had an old trail camera mounted on a post to catch deer. It had caught a red pickup parked near the boundary the night before, and a woman stepping out with a cooler and a can. The footage was grainy, but the silhouette and the truck bed told a story you couldn't ignore. You don't need high def to see a match in someone's hands. The video spread like spilled gasoline on social media. Within a day, everyone had seen the woman with the neat haircut and the HOA badge on a jacket, striding along the fence. She looked at the camera like a statue. The town's group chat did what town group chats do. It filled with furious emojis, exclamation points, and someone saying they had seen her arguing with me about the roadside flowers. A few people defended her, said cameras could be planted, asked for calm. Most people wanted answers. Karen's face on the camera didn't match the person who sent letters or showed up at meetings with a binder. The camera captured something colder. When the sheriff served the search warrant and took her phone, she wore the face of a woman surprised to be in a story she hadn't planned for. Her hands were steady, though, when she made a call. That steadiness made people angrier. It's unnerving to watch someone act like they haven't done anything wrong when they know the roof is on fire. I thought it would end with a fine and an apology. Everyone told me how sorry they were. They poured coffee for me in the feed store and raised money for a new fence. But then the insurance inspector came, tall and perfunctory, clipboard in hand, and a look like a man who had spent years cataloging loss. He walked the burned edge, prodded a charred stalk, and asked for paperwork. Acres planted, projected yield, estimated market price. I handed him my notebooks. Late April planting dates, germination notes, the seed invoice, the invoices for fertilizer. This was not a hobby field. 3 generations had watched this row get planted. We had a contract with a buyer who ships to a feedlot in Texas. This crop was not a number on a form, it was payroll, rent, and college tuition rolled into kernels. The policy on the farm wasn't some cheap add-on. After a bad season a few years back, we had poured money into a proper crop insurance policy. The town knows you don't gamble with 80,000 bushels. The policy covered fire, arson, and a list of calamities that felt distant until that skinny night. They sent adjusters, men and women in boots like me but with logos sewn onto their jackets. They did tests and calculations and satellite passes and leaned over my spreadsheets with the attention of men who balance ledgers with funerals. Then they called. The adjuster's voice on the phone was careful. "There's a clause," she said. "You documented your losses properly. You have the proper insured value for the acreage. We can validate your projected yield given last year's numbers, the fertilization schedule, the buyer contract. You're covered." When she said the figure, $2 million, it felt like a wild number in my mouth, but she was precise. They had insured the crop at the replacement value, commercial yield, projected market rates, expected output. $2 million would keep the payroll paid, but more than money, that number meant vindication. Insurance doesn't heal a burned field. It buys time, stores equipment, pays bills, and sometimes, if it's done right, it forces the town to look at what happened. You might think the first thing that happens next is a quiet check. You might imagine me standing in a farmhouse doorway and taking a look at a bank account. But money in a case like this is legal artillery. The insurer wanted proof beyond the adjuster's word there had been a willful act. The sheriff wanted a confession. The DA wanted a clean case. We filed civil claims and criminal charges. The DA's office wrapped the criminal case tight: arson, reckless endangerment, property destruction. Karen was indicted and arraigned with the calmness of someone who reads procedural rules like scripture. She posted a statement on the HOA page about being targeted by a vendetta and how she had always worked to protect property values. Her language was lawyerly work, measured, styled, without heat. People read it and flipped allegiances. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a local TV crew drove up and shined lights into my yard. They asked me if I wanted to go on camera. I said no. I wanted to tell the truth, but I didn't want to sound like a man capitalizing on misery. The trial was a small-town drama with a judge who had taught civics in the high school. The prosecution laid out the security footage, the gas can with her fingerprints on it, because she was careless enough to leave prints on a ring they found in the cigarette lighter compartment of her pickup, and the receipts showing she had bought gasoline in a can at the hardware store 2 hours before the fire. The defense tried alternate theories. Someone else could have been there, cameras could be tampered with, her fingerprints could have transferred. You can smell desperation when someone swings for doubt. They called witnesses who talked about her devotion to neighborhood aesthetics, people who said she'd shoveled snow for an elderly neighbor. None of that answered why a person would walk into a field with a lighter and watch it catch. I sat in the back of the courtroom with my wife and 2 kids. The kid on the left had his nose in a comic book. Boys do that to stay anchored. The younger one kept asking if we could get the combine fixed. You learn to measure outrage in the small practical things. The jury deliberated for a day. When they came back guilty, the room exhaled in a dozen different ways. The punishment in the criminal case was one thing. The civil claim was another. The insurance company wanted to subrogate. They would pay me. Then they would sue Karen to recover what they paid. It's the way insurers make things right without having to be romantically right about it. They wanted to show the town that arson is not profitable. People in town had opinions about the money. Some whispered that I was greedy. Others said it was justice. The truth was a stubborn thing. The money didn't feel like revenge. It felt like repair. It meant my workers would still have jobs. It meant the kids could finish school without our needing to refinance the house. It meant I could replant when the frost dropped and maybe, with work and the right season, make a season next year. Karen's fall was slow and awkward. She lost her HOA position, which in a small town is a better equivalent of public shaming than you'd think. The association voted her out, and then the bank where she had a modest mortgage had a look at her legal liabilities, and started asking questions. She sold the red pickup a month later to someone who wanted a truck to haul compost. She moved her inbox from public HOA boards to private. She posted apologies that read like exhibits: careful, remorseful, and lacking heat. People accepted some apologies the way they accept rain, because the weather said so. There are consequences you can't pay for. Neighbors who had trusted her felt betrayed. Kids in town learned a lesson about running with torches. My family learned a different one. Systems matter. Contracts and receipts and documentation are what we hand to the future, so it will remember us fairly. Insurance is not a guarantee of goodness, but it's a ledger that sometimes forces truth into daylight. The check from the insurer came in stages: an advance to cover immediate needs, then the full amount after the courts handed down their decisions. When the big number hit the ledger, when the accountant made numbers line up and the bills stopped looking like threats, I sat in the combine and cried like a fool. My hands were caked with ash. The tears felt like water on dirt. It was not joy exactly. It was a terrible relief, the sort that tastes like salt in cold coffee. We used the payout to buy new seed, to repair the irrigation, to pay the crews that had come with no promise of more work. We put aside money for legal fees, because the insurer's lawyers hadn't thought for a second that they were doing charity. The DA's office took the criminal conviction as a reason to press for restitution. Karen was ordered to pay to help make the ledger balance. She had to sell off some assets. It was, how do I say this without sounding mean, fitting. She had torched a life, and we, the town, had made sure she paid what she could. The moralizing in the papers was immediate. Arson for aesthetics made the headline in the county clickbait column. People in town retold the story at barbecues the way sailors tell storms. Some of those retellings softened events, others sharpened them to a point. Old men at the feed store shook their heads and said they had always known HOA people were trouble. Teenagers used the video as prank fodder and remixed it with memes. Somewhere in all this, I made peace with the fact that disaster will always be an audience. I don't like being heroic in other people's stories. I didn't want the money more than I wanted a field full of green stalks that sang in a wind. Money is a tool and a memory. It bought us stability, not satisfaction. The orchard of small, daily satisfactions. A well-fed crew, a kid learning to mend a fence, the soft thump of ears filling in late summer. Those are the things you can't write a check for. There was a point where I had to decide what to do with Karen. Justice had its say. The law had given her fines, community service, and restitution. I could have asked for more. I could have pushed until her name meant something in the records that would shame her forever. Instead, at sentencing, I stood and read a statement. I spoke about the smell of smoke and the way it had sat in my hair for days. I spoke about paying people who had families and the way the harvest had been a promise to my kids. I didn't yell. I didn't call names. I told the courtroom that a field is not just money and that arson takes more than crops. It takes trust. Some people thought I was soft. Some thought I was generous. What I was, most of all, was tired of hate. There was nothing in me that wanted a life taken in return for a burned field. I wanted practical things: restitution, repair, and an assurance that if someone else tried this, they would be stopped. We replanted the next season, because that's what you do. Planting is a stubborn act of faith. The new corn came up, and green returned like a patient neighbor. It was smaller acreage the first year. We took it slow, we watched the property line, and we put in better cameras, not because we wanted to spy, but because we wanted protection. The town was different afterward. HOA meetings had new faces, softer edges. People sharpened their fences, but also their empathy, oddly enough. Years later, the burned field shows up in pictures like a scar. When I walk that stretch in October and the dry cobs crack under my boots, I think about probability and malice and the small boxes we all live in. I think about kindness from strangers at the fire line and the volunteer who loaned us a baler when the combine was in repair. I think about the number 2 million, a blunt instrument that kept us afloat, and about how it sprouted, oddly enough, a debate in town about insurance and community care. HOA Karen moved away eventually. The red pickup changed hands. I don't wish her ill. I don't wish her a garden of regrets. I wish people who hold rules close to their chest would learn to hold people closer. That's not legal advice, it's an observation. Rules can save lawns. Rules can also blind you to the humanity of a neighbor. In the end, the field healed the way fields do, slowly, with seasons stacked on seasons. The dogs grew old and new hands learned the rows. The video of the fire lives in the internet's attic, a cautionary clip that teaches more than a moral. It teaches how fragile the things we take for granted are, and how the practical armor of contracts, receipts, and neighbors ready to hose down a blaze is sometimes the only thing between you and ruin. So when people ask how I felt about the $2 million, I tell them this: it paid the bills, it ensured the kids' education, and it made the town reckon with itself. But it didn't bring back the quiet that comes on a dawn in August when the corn is tall and the air is full of insect song. That quiet is a kind of small miracle, and some things even a big check can't buy back.